Uh, Good afternoon. Welcome to the February meeting of the Charlotte City Council's Intergovernmental Relations Committee. My name is Braxton Winston. I serve as one of the co-chairs of this committee. Why don't we go ahead and dive right in? We'll do introductions, and I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Fenton, so we can get into the agenda, which is decent. So we'll do introductions inside the room, and then we'll go to council members and staff and visitors online.
Dana Fenton with the City Manager's Office.
Brent Cagle, City Manager's Office.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
And online, start with committee members.
Ed Driggs, committee member.
Matt Newton, committee member.
And staff and visitors online.
John Easterling, contract lobbyist, Kilpatrick, Townsend and Stockton Strategies on behalf of the City of Charlotte.
Hampton Billups also with Kilpatrick Townsend.
Nelson Freeman, KTS Strategies.
All right, thank you. All right, Mr. Fenton, I think it's on you. Or we'll start with Mr. Cagle. I'll start with the agenda overview.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. So our agenda today, as you have already mentioned, we have 3 items plus a discussion of next committee meeting. First item, Mr. Fenton will present to us a federal update. Second item will be a state update. Third item, I will present to you and the rest of the committee a possible recommendation that could go to City Council related to government consolidation. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Fenton.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, we're doing the federal legislative update. Overall, folks, we don't have a lot more to provide you with since last month's meeting. Next slide, please. So a couple major things have happened is that on the federal appropriations front on Friday, there was sent a bill to the president to extend the continuing resolution for the current year budget to March 11th. It was going to expire Friday night, and now it's going to be, they're looking to try to get a omnibus appropriations measure passed by March 11th to send to the president. And the lawmakers have agreed upon the top line spending totals, and this enables the subcommittees to get in there and focus on the details inside each subcommittee area, including policy writers and earmarks. And then as soon as they get that done, or actually before they get that done, the president is going to submit his FY 2023 budget to the Congress around March 1. On that day, which I believe is a week from tomorrow, the president gives his State of the Union address to the Congress and to the nation. There's another bill that the Congress has been working on. There are 2 separate bills out there on this subject, and they would have to be conference between the House and the Senate. It has to do with competition between the U.S. and China, economic competition, and there's quite a few different things in these bills. But there's also some there are some positions that have been taken by both chambers that the other chamber has some pretty deep disagreements with. So there's going to have to be some time to iron out those differences. What's interesting about the House version of the bill that passed is that there would be quite a bit of funding in there for historically black colleges and universities, such as Johnson C. Smith University for STEM research and in areas like that. Next slide, please. One thing that we have not heard a lot about lately is the Build Back Better Act. Of course, that's the bill that was stopped in the Senate after it passed the House. There are supposed to be some negotiations going on with some of the key players, like the President, Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema. And at the same time, the administration is starting to rework that proposal. There's the idea of including some of those pieces of legislation that enjoy broad support in another spending measure. And also, congressional Democrats are looking at adding deficit reduction measures, because that is something that has been a concern that has been expressed by Senator Manchin. So it really appears to me and to others that it's going to take some time before anything approaching the Build Back Better Act would be passed. In the meantime, we'll continue looking to see what may be included in other measures. Next slide, please. 3 weeks from now, the week of March 14th through 16th, is the National League of Cities Congressional City Conference in D.C. And at this point, our lobbyists are trying to get briefings scheduled with our congressional delegation for City Council to review the federal legislative agenda with them. And we are targeting the evening of Monday, March 14th, for a pre-brief with Holland and Knight, our federal contract lobbyist, and then the briefings would be preferably all of them on Tuesday, March 15th, but if needed, Wednesday, March 16th. And of course, we'll be providing the schedule and briefing materials to the City Council prior to the conference, probably about 2 weeks from now. Next slide, please. And then in the briefings themselves, this is sort of the outline of what we try to follow in these briefings. Talk about some of the key 2021 accomplishments we had, and we had quite a few this year, or last year I should say, which I'll go over on the next page. And then we'll review the 22 legislative agenda, then ask our delegation what we can do to help them out. Next slide, please. And some of our key accomplishments from last year, of course, was the new funding that's been made available for a lot of different modes of transportation, like transit, aviation, highways, rail, the funding for sustainable infrastructure, digital equity, and water. Those are things that the City Council has been advocating for continuously over the last several years. And then, of course, there was the emergency funding that was provided for the city for housing, aviation, transit, and other needs that were provided in the American Rescue Plan. And, of course, there is the Graves Grant that was awarded to the city for the Charlotte Transportation Center. And the next steps, 2 weeks, we'll get the briefing materials and schedule to the City Council. Then the following week will be the congressional briefings. And then as soon as we come back on the 21st is our March IRC meeting. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, concludes my presentation. Be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. I have two questions before I turn it over to see if anybody on the committee has. I remember during last meeting, you mentioned that the infrastructure bill will need an appropriation bill.
Yes, sir.
I know that was expected at some point in time in the near future. Is there any update on that?
Well, that's the FY22 appropriations omnibus spending measure they're talking about right now. And again, the leadership in both chambers believes that getting that passed by March 11th is very doable for them. And that's their goal, is to get it to the president by that date for him to sign.
And also just thinking about what's going on up in the General Assembly with new congressional districts and everything like that, we might have an additional one that might be in our purview in terms of somebody to reach out to. And would that be the new district, or would that have representation seated when we get to DC? And should we bet on increasing the number of visits we have by one?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mr. Chairman. Last week, the General Assembly did pass realigned district maps for the State House and for the U.S. Congress. And this week, the Supreme Court is considering those maps. And depending, they could recommend redrawing them. They could redraw the maps themselves and things like that. But as of right now, from the map, is that Mecklenburg County would be represented by 2 members of the House of Representatives, which is the same as what we have now. in one district, which is greater part, it's about three-quarters Charlotte dominated. Representative Adams is the incumbent in that district. And then in the other district, the 14th, which is one, is roughly like southwest portion of Mecklenburg County, everything west of Providence Road, southwest of Freedom Drive, Mount Holly Road. And that would also be paired with Gaston County, Cleveland County, and part of Rutherford County. And as of right now, the only member of Congress who lives in that district is Representative Bishop. But there was also social media last week reporting that perhaps maybe once the dust settles, he could be moving to what's, I think the number of the district is the 9th district. His district right now goes from Charlotte to the southeast. And this new one goes from Charlotte to the west. So
I think either way, I think we would want to think about and consider, even if, for instance, that 9th district doesn't touch Mecklenburg County, doesn't come into Mecklenburg County. Right. That wouldn't necessarily preclude us from visiting with the representative there, as we often meet with Representative Hudson, who at one point in time his district did come into Mecklenburg County, but it doesn't anymore. Right. But being that we have regional interests, I just wonder if that's something that, regardless of the way the map gets cut up, it would be prudent for us to keep meeting with those representatives.
It's a good question. There are several other representatives around the area too, like Congressman Hudson. You have also Congressman McHenry, and then then there's another district that comes in through Iredell County, and I can't remember who the incumbent in that district is because of the changes. But it usually gets down to a matter of time, the amount of time that we have up there, and also availability. They're going to prioritize people in their own district, cities in their own district first. But certainly do not disagree with you on the notion that we should be talking with folks outside of Mecklenburg County.
Thank you. I'll open it up to Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering if there's any update on the portion of the infrastructure bill that we can expect in Mecklenburg County. I think I heard a number like $9 billion for North Carolina, of which about $7 billion, I believe, was going to be for roads. But do we know any more about that now?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Driggs. I think I can tell you right now is that in terms of the guaranteed funding for Mecklenburg County, the city, and so forth, the funding that was cited in those reports that would go to the state of North Carolina, that is what we would refer to as formula funding. And it's not competitive grants, it's money that would go to the state. And we have very, very few resources like that here coming to the city. One of those is the airport infrastructure program. There was the one last month when Haley Gentry was here. We were talking a little bit about that, and we had just received the notice that the airport would receive $43 million per year over the next 5 years from that program. The other three are transit programs, which we don't have updated apportionments for at this time.
So would that funding represent a significant portion of the federal funding that we're expecting to get for our transformational mobility network?
The funding that we would seek for the transformational mobility network, assuming, of course, we have local funding to match it, I am unsure just what that amount is, what would be required over the next 5 years. But at this time, I don't have a figure for that, so.
Okay, but otherwise, the situation is pretty much as we understood it to be before, related to the infrastructure bill. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Heisel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Dana, you answered a portion of one of my questions that Mr. Goods asked you about what would come to North Carolina and how that gets divvied up, and who decides that? Is that just the General Assembly decides who gets that money, and potentially Mecklenburg couldn't get any? Let's put the TMN aside, that portion aside, but how does that get decided?
That's a really good question, too. There are several different streams of revenues that would be coming to the state, whether for digital equity, for loans, for water, sewer, stormwater projects, and then even the dollars coming for transportation projects that the state gets. In the case of I think of all three of those, that I am unsure as to. I know that the General Assembly will have to appropriate the funding. Now, the question is, who gets to decide how that funding is spent? Will it be the General Assembly, or will it be the administration? And in the case of the transportation funding, there is the Strategic Transportation Investments Program that governs how the funding is generally allocated around the state. And of course, the funding that comes from the federal government is supposed to be used for very specified uses. It's the same thing with the loan programs that come in for water, sewer, stormwater, and for digital equity. So right now, it's really hard to say who will actually, how much power the General Assembly would have over spending the funding, other than appropriations. There could be some funding in there that's flexible, that probably you would have to get an appropriation, or you have to get direction from the General Assembly for. But in other cases, because it's for a specified use, it would have to be used for that. And then, of course, you'd have the grant-making processes where generally, if there's a competitive process to access that funding in any loans, then that would probably be decided by the administration.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, in terms of the transportation funding, roads, bridges, the DOT has got a tremendous shortfall in projects that have already been approved in the STIP. Is it possible that that money would essentially just go towards those projects?
It's really hard to say because a lot of that funding, again, is for specified uses, like the bridge program. There's about $450 million per year coming in over the next 5 years to the state just for bridges. They would have to use that to repair or replace bridges. And I suppose people could say, yeah, you could decide to, the state could decide to try to get some of that funding that's coming in for specified uses into things that qualify in terms of the projects that have been delayed, perhaps. But that's a really tough question to answer right now.
Okay. And then my second question is, Dana, more logistics. Is this going to be sort of a last minute call as to whether or not we are in Washington, we have meetings on the 16th, or because certainly I think, a lot of us would love to have them all in one day and then not, be able to change our flights and hotels. When will we know that?
I think in about 2 weeks we should know. Typically that's when we do know, the week before.
The week before, okay.
Yeah, and I would prefer too to have all the meetings in one day, because I know that a lot of you do need to get out, do need to get back here to get on with your lives and all that.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, unless Mr. Newton has anything, we can move on to the state update.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the state update, one word, redistricting. Last month, I think, when Ches McDowell, he said that word, everything's been taken up by redistricting. It's been the same thing since then. And again, last week, the General Assembly drew new district maps by the order of the North Carolina Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is looking at those maps this week and will be supposedly this week coming back with with their final decisions. And a week like this, you'll see a lot on social media about things, and so it's going to be a long week, I think, for the map makers and for the people who have to decide whether those maps go forward or not.
Concise report from Mr. Fenton.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Driggs.
Thank you. Mr. Fenton, I thought the Supreme Court order said that the legislature should draw new maps and that those would then be submitted to the trial court, to the 3 judges. And it's only if somebody then objects to their conclusion and appeals that it could get back to the Supreme Court. So are you saying it goes directly back to the Supreme Court?
I believe that is what I said. That's what I meant. However, I'm going to turn to our lobbyist at KTS if my understanding is incorrect on that. Is there any?
No, the maps were submitted back to the appeals court, and they'll make the decision whether or not it does or doesn't meet the court standard, and then from there, it would then flow back up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court make a decision about whether or not the special masters would then take over that responsibility.
Okay.
Right. So I'm interested in that just because of the implications. The filing is supposed to start in a couple of days. Mm-hmm. Well, what kind of timeline are people expecting? Is the appeals court going to be the same justices who approved the maps before?
I actually don't know the answer to that. John, I know you've been tracking that one.
Yes, so the trial court will be, as now the 3 judges that approved it before. If there has to be a special master, the court has already appointed 3 former members of the state judiciary. I believe Bob Edmonds, Bob Orr, and Tom Ross, who's the former, I think, president of Davidson College and former UNC system president.
So the trial court could order that the maps were unacceptable as presented by the legislature, and I think the Supreme Court said that others could submit maps in conjunction with, on the same timeline as the legislature. But is anything that the trial court does going to be non-appealable, or do we still have the possibility that they end up back at the Supreme Court?
The Supreme Court will make the final decision, but everything that the trial court is presented before them is appealable.
Right. So therefore, we do have the prospect of it going to the trial court, and whatever the outcome is there, causing it to go back on appeal to the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And meanwhile, we have this interesting situation where filing is supposed to open again on the 24th. And we will either have just received maps if all went well, or we won't yet have maps at that point. So we haven't heard anything about whether that filing date is being reconsidered.
This is Nelson. There has not been outward discussion on that. There definitely has been kind of behind the scenes. We've had conversations with folks who are contemplating a 1 week's delay if the event that things kind of drag out to the 11th hour. Though that's certainly possible that they maintain the current status because that's what was set with the courts. But it would be court ordered any changes.
Fun and games. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from committee members?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. I'm hoping not to just belabor the current conversation. It's my understanding that the maps will be reviewed by the trial court, including a 3-judge panel, and then go back in front of the Supreme Court for an additional review, just procedurally. That will happen automatically up until Wednesday, at which point, by Wednesday at 5 p.m., there'll be an opportunity to appeal that decision. I understand that there is a statutorily defined period of time in which the Board of Elections has to prepare for elections, and that we are running up against that deadline. Is that a fair assessment of this statutory criteria for the Board of Elections? And in as much as it is, you were mentioning the possibility of a 1 week delay, which I think would put filing out till March 2nd, or I'm sorry, March 3rd, and then probably conclude it by March 11th. But would that also, so kind of given the scenario here, could you speak to maybe any Board of Elections requirements in as much as their ability to hold elections this year and how much time they need? And if that 1 week period is extended, does that fall within that? And is that something that, you mentioned kind of behind the scenes people are talking about, is that maybe an expectation? Is an appeal even an expectation here?
That's a lot to unpack on circumstances. So there is a statutory timeline by which the filing has to conclude in order for all of the ballots to be appropriately printed and mailed to all the various constituents that request that. And so I don't have that at my fingertips, but it is statutorily defined. I will say, to achieve the May 17th time, the primaries would have, the filings would have to stay as they are today. I think the implication is if they do delay candidate filing, it could cause a delay in the primary, which would require the Supreme Court to step in and issue a new order to delay that. But I think that all would have to occur from the Supreme Court side.
Mm-hmm.
And on the contemplation of appeals, that's up to the interested parties.
And that would be, so if we're talking about an appeal from the state Supreme Court, that would be to the U.S. Supreme Court in one possible scenario. And then secondly, if the Supreme Court were to invalidate the maps themselves, so the state Supreme Court were to invalidate the maps, that's when we would find ourselves in the scenario of the possible 1 week delay, right?
I think you'd have to have a more specific conversation with legal counsel. If the court invalidates the maps, I think that sets off a whole other stream of consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which could potentially result in a longer than 1 week delay.
They couldn't speak to what the court would do.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they're the ones that are going to decide.
Gotcha. Oh, all right, thank you. But a lot of uncertainty there. Right.
We're going to get 4-year terms without even doing anything. We're going to get into our first 4-year term before this is over.
But we got to make sure the maps are fair and accurate too. But thank you all. Thank you.
It'll be another interesting week in North Carolina government and politics. Just like to recognize my co-chair, Tariq Bakari, who has entered the room. And unless anybody else has any comments or questions about the state update, I'll turn it over to Mr. Cagle so he can get us started on this next topic, government consolidation. I'll just remind everybody on committee and whoever's watching, the mayor and council are going through a different, trying to go through a different type of committee process with the rest of this term. And one of the policy area that this committee has decided to focus on, or at least the policy question, is to take a look at government consolidation efforts and the spectrum of potential there. During the last strategy session, the mayor, after our presentation, asked us to come back to provide a bit more definition, a bit more of a concrete definition for the council at large as to what this committee meant and our efforts moving forward. Within that time, the co-chairs, myself and Mr. Bakari, have met with Mr. Cagle and Mr. Fenton to go over, to kind of debrief off of the last committee discussion and the request made at the strategy session. So with no further ado, I guess Mr. Cagle will present what staff has come back to us with after that conversation.
Yes, sir. Mr. Winston, Mr. Bakari, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to present this to you. I will say what we have so far is based on the conversations that we've heard and that we've had so far. It is certainly we're seeking input and guidance from the committee as we move forward, and we can make changes as necessary leading into the next strategy session upcoming. Next slide. So there are two documents. I prepared a presentation, but there is also a document that shows the actual draft recommendation. This presentation tries to boil down that recommendation. Paragraph 1 of the recommendation really would focus on 3 areas of responsibility for the committee, the Intergovernmental Relations Committee, to start as a starting point to look at. Not necessarily only 3, but these would be the first 3 to start with. And these are 3 areas that are currently either duplicated between city and county functions or divided between city and county functions. And we think that would merit further evaluation to see if there are ways to change the relationships to produce greater levels of efficiency or effectiveness going forward. Next slide. So the 3 areas that there we go. So the 3 areas that staff presented or that I identified and I'm presenting today would be a look at the economic development functions that are currently divided or split between the city and the county. Both the city of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County have separate economic development functions. We think that there may be efficiency or effectiveness gains by evaluating that relationship. 2, permitting functions that are split between the city and county. And again, this would look at a study that's already been completed and those recommendations and really the status of those recommendations on whether or not there has been any gains made to implement those, or maybe we should be looking to make further gains to implement some of those recommendations, or possibly even explore entirely new recommendations. The third area would be the solid waste interlocal agreement. So currently the solid waste interlocal agreement will expire in 2028. This is an interlocal that has very specific roles and responsibilities that the city plays and the county plays in our trash and recycling responsibilities. These are divided, and we think that it would be worth looking at, is that the proper split? Are there opportunities for greater efficiency and effectiveness, or even innovation by rethinking that split that's established in the interlocal agreement, possibly even before 2028 when it expires?
Let me pause there for a sec. I think I like the direction you're headed. I think the one comment I would say is this referral was about teeing up the next level of staff diligence beyond, the couple hours of an individual or 2 individual council members kind of talking about something and more giving the mandate to do the work. I am opposed to us trying in the time we've had to then say, okay, here are the 3 things we're going to go do. I don't have any problem with this being like here are 3 examples so people can wrap their minds around it. But I know for a fact there are just as many opportunities that we could explore in the triangulation between EMS, fire, and police. There's Parks and Rec. There's affordable housing. There's just a litany, and I think what we really want to do is not handcuff ourselves to 3 good ones that we know definitely make the list. Rather, if it ends up being 10 or 12 or 15 viable areas that get kind of brought to us, our next round is both looking at what are the impacts that can be made for the Charlotte taxpayer and citizen, for the folks that need these things, how can we make them better? But also, I think we have to practically look at them and say, some of them are just going to be more politically hard to do than others. So that way we weigh in both the low-hanging fruit nature of what we need to achieve and the overall impact. So I think my only recommendation would be in that paragraph 1, instead of saying 3 areas, we just say inside the scope of services provided by these areas, and then we just tweak this to say, here are 3 examples, so that it's illustrated in that way without us kind of having our back to the wall in a scoping where we might really find some lower hanging better fruit in another area.
Yeah, just to follow with that, I would definitely do want Mr. Cagle to be able to finish his presentation and let the committee butt in. I think that was, as Mr. Bukhari described, was a bit more accurate to the conversations that we had. I really do love the overall recommendation. But one, I think what we wanted to do was to be able to let the committee as well as council kind of get an idea of a menu of potential directions that we can go. I see, these 3 options that you brought, for instance, number 1 is potentially very highly impactful. Number 2 seems like some low-hanging fruit, being that we already have studies and recommendations. And number 3 sounds very pragmatic. It sounds like a very pragmatic approach. I'd like to be able to, for the committee, to consider as many of these options as possible so we can really define the type of direction that we want to go. So would be interested to how you chose these 3, but also the other options that you considered in whittling it down. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So maybe an attempt to respond to your questions and also to the comments so far. Absolutely understand we can take a shot at opening the, so as we put these on paper, I think that it's a fair point that these should be listed as examples and not exclusive to all other options. And I can take the opportunity before the strategy session to provide you an updated copy that would be more along the lines of the comments today. Now, I
think real quick, just in that, rather than belabor the point, I think it's really simple. On the first page, instead of saying 3, say all. So we will examine all areas of responsibility that are currently duplicated or divided. And on the next page, paragraph 2, 3 areas, 3 examples that the Intergovernmental Relations Committee will be looking to. So that way, because really I think you've jumped into a bit of the body of work, and as you've listed these 3 out. So I don't think there's anything wrong with what you've done. I just think if you made those 2 tweaks, then these are illustrative for our colleagues so they can see examples of what we're talking about. But then you set to work, and then the next time the committee comes together here, after the referral is made, we're looking at a universe of 15 things or 12 things or whatever. And then I think the piece as I read ahead about the city attorney and doing that, I think that's great, just minus the 3, anywhere there's citations of 3. And then finally, I do think you might want to contemplate how you can engage with the staff leadership in the other governmental agencies as you're doing this stuff. So it's not us crafting a list of our desires or demands, rather all 3 of the major organizations doing that. And I think that leads to the big question of, clearly this is something that doesn't work without towns and farther other things, but it's kind of like, if we're going to scope down our first steps, where can we look at just some no-brainer areas of overlap as we're walking towards it?
Yes, sir. So just following up on these 3, certainly these 3 are not the only 3. These were the first 3 that came to mind as internally after our conversation, that came to mind as things that seem to both, well, in the case of ED, has not been looked at, right? But it has been discussed about, is our structure really the most effective. In the case of permitting, it has been looked at, but I don't think it's been fully implemented, right? There's always been discussions about doing it, but we've never actually got in there. And quite honestly, on the solid waste item, it is an area that solid waste would say merits looking at, because the interlocal agreement really dictates everything that we do or even that we cannot do in the areas of recycling, bulk yard waste, and then pure solid waste trash pickup. And 2028 is when it expires, but as we think about alternatives, if we want to make changes, there are a lot of long lead items that would be required. And so while 2028 is a ways away, it's really just around the corner in terms of thinking about if we were to make sort of fundamental shifts in how we would approach that interlocal. It's something that we would need to look at now. And I think that it also goes along with the innovation barn being opened last year. And what do those partnerships around circular economy and sustainability look like for us going forward? So again, I apologize. I was not trying to indicate that these would be, the three exclusive areas, and I understand the point that we can make.
Yeah, I think if you just make those slight tweaks that show thoughtfulness, yet not boxing in from a scope perspective, I think looking at Councilman Winston here, we're in agreement. We'll be interested to hear if our colleagues have similar or different thoughts.
Yes, sir. Okay, so paragraph 2, our next slide, please. So again, this slide is to acknowledge that the committee will need to engage the city attorney's office on many, if not all of these as we move forward. Next slide. Okay, so this is one where I put this in here, I suppose, as a straw man to get comment on. First phase of work with a completion or report out date in June 2022. Again, I put that in there because it seemed reasonable given the 3 items or however many items, but that was just as a means for facilitating the conversation with both chairs and the committee. That's all that I have.
Thank you, Mr. Cagle. Committee members, wanted to give everybody the opportunity to wait. Mr. Driggs? Mr. Driggs.
Yeah, thanks. Has anybody in the city reached out to anybody in the county to kind of suggest that we're thinking about these things? Because we're having a public meeting here and we're talking about these things, and I'm already wary about a bad reaction. And I think the way that we ought to pursue this is for council to consider outreach to the county on an exploratory basis without official actions, and just find out whether there's any interest on their part in being a party to discussions about these things. And I can tell you there's a lot of history here, and there's a lot of sensitivity, and there's also money issues involved. When you start changing the way these things work, there are going to be questions about how the finances get resolved. And for those of you who were watching, for example, as we work through a renegotiation of the law enforcement service districts, the terms there, things can get tricky in a hurry. Brent, I think you were alluding to the Gardner study, is that right?
Yes, sir.
So we did pay a lot of money to have consultants go through our permitting process and our development processes, and they came up with elaborate recommendations. All that work has been done, and it pointed to some sort of a unification or better coordination of the activities. So, we need to kind of use that as a reference. But I would really like, as a first step, for us to just communicate with the county manager, with members of the Board of Commissioners, that we have identified a need to do this, or an opportunity to do this, and find out whether we are wasting our time or whether they will come on board. I just think the likelihood that they will work with us is better if we talk to them sooner.
Yeah, Councilman Driggs, great point as always. And that was really the genesis of how we got here. Braxton and I, under kind of our own individual initiative, actually Braxton's initiative, and I joined in, brought together the kind of intergovernmental leads and a couple others from the county and from the school board. We brought Dana along with us, and they brought Jeter and their other staff member, and we sat around and had a dialogue, a long, robust dialogue about it. And actually, everyone was like, yeah, you know, we're very much on board, we're very interested. But then we just kind of defaulted to, but this has been tried 1,000 times with individual members of each body, and it always like hits this roadblock of, okay, well, you've got to have staff support it, or staff has gone and done it without electeds, and it, you know, goes so far, but then it requires those. So it was actually our takeaway from that initial discussion to see if we couldn't find a way to show them what we had talked about could get a body-wide mandate so staff could work on it and a committee could look at it and feed it back up to the broader council. And what I believe will happen after us taking the lead on this first step successfully is both of those bodies will then follow that exact footstep so that they get a body-wide mandate for staff to work on it and a committee to focus on it. And then all of a sudden we have something that has never been done, at least at this level, which is like, it's not individual people or staff members pushing something, it's a fully unified thing. That leaves out a whole bunch of question marks still. How are we going to do this with the towns, which is vitally critical that we figure all that, and all the other players. But I think that the mission is start simple, and then once we have that kind of at bat, then sit everyone down and say, okay, where can we get a win without biting something off that's just so politically complicated that we just get bogged down in it. So it's good thoughts, and I think that's the genesis of how we got here.
And then just real quick, Mr. Driggs, just to build off of what Mr. Bakari said, and I definitely want to give Mr. Fenton an opportunity if you want to talk at all about some of those conversations. I completely agree. As Mr. Bakari said, this kind of recommendation was born out of all these kind of ad hoc consolidated conversations that are happening. But let's also remember the sequence where we're at right now. We are trying to get this committee charge kind of buttoned down so that we can get give a clear message of what we wish to do on a policy standpoint to first our own colleagues on city council and the mayor, and then once that is kind of buttoned up, I think it'll be the prerogative of this committee and the city council of the best way to engage our intergovernmental partners, right? Is it a letter, from this committee to other intergovernmental committees around the county explaining this? Is it going to those meetings or reaching out? Is it an op-ed? Whatever to decide, but first and foremost, we have to get this charge from the mayor answered, I do believe.
So I think there is a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation here, and so I get what you're doing, like trying to find a place to start, but frankly, in the context of what we're talking about, I would be in favor of taking those three examples out completely and just saying, putting out there the basic proposition that we want to explore areas to cooperate, rationalize, and improve our service delivery, et cetera, and that we will be doing some work in order to be able to engage with other local governments. I would also note that the commitment of more than 4 hours of staff time does call for a council vote, so the committee should be careful to formulate exactly what it is we want the county to vote on, and then bring that up for a vote. And that would, for one, somewhat consolidate our position in the pursuit of this, and also authorize the use of the staff time.
Yeah, I fully agree, Councilman Driggs, it's cleaner to just take out the examples, because again, it's good for us as we think about what it could look like, but one, we don't want to box ourselves in, as we said, and two, we don't want to start on a foot of a preconceived notion with another partner who might have a better value prop. Agree. And then the thought process on the staff time was, I'm fine with the council vote if that's what we need to refer it, but I believe a mayor or manager referral to a committee also then circumvents the 4-hour requirement. So all we were trying to do was, we couldn't get any further than where we had gotten at that point without staff and really taking it serious and legitimizing it. And we didn't also want to jump over that kind of thought that we have here. So this was the best path to get forward. And I think the most important thing when this is all done from our step is the fact that it was mandated, because then our partners who are clearly watching this, that were in the rooms with us as we were discussing this as our next step, that'll give them the roadmap and the confidence to go do this exact same thing in their bodies.
So I see the opportunity here, and I appreciate what you're doing. I don't need to tell you it's a bit of a minefield, and that's what I worry about. How we handle this very early work and the way we communicate now is what spares us the dug-in opposition later. And I think we saw that with our Transformational Mobility Network. We did too much planning in Charlotte, and by the time we got around to talking to others, their noses were out of joint. So I think we're doing the right thing. If the committee could kind of formulate what exactly it is we want to take to council, and then make sure that council is aware and on board, I think that would be good, because this is big. This is not, these are not minor issues, and the individuals in the various departments have a lot of history. There's a lot of kind of emotion around a lot of these topics. So just go there and offer that olive branch right away. Thank you.
Mr. Fenton, with that point, is there any kind of feedback or insight you might be able to give our colleagues that are not as privy to the conversations those ad hoc meetings that we've been having? What has been the response from county or school board staff as to the ideas that we're putting forward?
Yeah, I did. Thank you. I did meet with my counterparts about a week ago, and they would have to have some sort of a agreement from their governing bodies before they could start working on something like this. So there would have to be some.
And I believe that based on the conversations we've had with them to date, that if this path proves successful of us voting out of this committee today, recommendation for a referral back to this committee, bureaucracy is so wonderful. Once they see that, I believe our partners that we've talked to and their staff support would more than likely, if not 100% certainty, go about it and get that done on their sides. And I think then after hearing Councilman Drake's feedback as well as our own discussions, if we change paragraph 1 to be all instead of 3, which is the motion I'll intend to make, if we lose all of paragraph 2, we've seen it, we've said it aloud, so our colleagues and others in other bodies will see the examples we're setting forth, but also see that we did not hard code them in. We come into this with no preconceived notions, but a partnership to work with these bodies. And then in paragraph 3, lose these 3 areas. And then in paragraph 4, lose the last sentence, which says upon completion of the first phase of work, the committee will seek agreement with the mayor and council for the committee to engage with the separate governmental agencies to determine their interests in pursuing proposed changes. And rather than that, as each of those bodies completes their own adoption of something like this, they will enter the work, and that will be the work together that will be brought through, not we're going to figure it all out and then engage them. I think that will be, I'm going to go ahead and make it, we don't have to, we'll second it if it's necessary. I'm going to make that as the motion of changes and for consideration to bring to the broader council body, and then we can hear discussions. So is there a second to that motion?
So, Mr. Bakari, could I suggest one other wording change?
Yes, please.
At page 2, right? So we're going to take out 3 areas and just say, we'll examine areas of responsibility duplicated, divided. And what I'm suggesting is, The goal is to identify ways to cooperate with other local governments to produce greater levels of efficiency and effectiveness.
Say that one more time, Mr. Driggs. I got half of it down.
Yeah, the goal is to identify ways to cooperate with other local governments to achieve greater levels of efficiency and effectiveness.
Perfect. So I will recast my motion to be exactly what I said before, but instead of just deleting paragraph 2, it is the goal is to, well, everything Councilman Driggs just said. You guys got that, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good point, Mr. Driggs.
Second that.
Okay, I think we're about to lose Julie. Julie, would you like to comment on this, please?
Yes, thank you. And I apologize, I have another meeting at 3, but I'm totally on board and I completely agree with all that was just said regarding those changes. I think one other thing as we move forward is if you take all of those different areas and perhaps even go a little bit further and say, here's why we're looking at it, here's what the opportunities are, whether it be for us, for the county, whatever, I think that'd be helpful. For example, the interlocal agreement for trash disposal. What am I saying? That particular solid waste. Thank you. That particular agreement, you're right. It goes until 2028, but there are opportunities in there that could be taken now if the county agreed to it. So, for example, and we learned this before the innovation barn was started, that when we go and we pick up solid waste, recycling in particular, from residents, we pay the county a tipping fee, and then the county pays, I think it's been Republic Industries to take the garbage, right? In Europe, it's the other way around. They're getting paid, those municipalities are getting paid for their recycling, and we're missing out on that completely. So there are, companies, I mean, it's much more sophisticated in Europe because it has to be under EU regulations, but we don't have the ability to take glass out of the stream, for instance. Well, we could with glass, but there's certain products we can't take out of the stream and even sell them to a recycling, an upcycling organization or the innovation barn for a higher purpose, a higher use. And in the meantime, the city and the county are paying fees to have that stuff put into landfill. So I think when we approach the county, if we even have that subtext of why we're even looking at some of these issues, what the cost savings are, or how it meets our goals, in this case, the CAP, I think that would be incredibly helpful too, and it could allow us to work on things like changes to the solid waste interlocal agreement prior to 2028.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Mayor Pro Tem, and I think that aligns directly with the point we made a minute ago of removing the titles, because that's the body of work, and I think that takes me one step further. As I think of the body of work, once this is referred properly, is that staff not just going to all of our departments and then the other government agencies doing the same, where there are hundreds of ideas they think they see every day, but also coming to each council member and then the elected bodies of the other, where we've had conversations where, just like you just spelled it off, one example, I'm sure everyone has 3 different ones that they stumbled into and saw. So it's really, it's an exercise of gathering all of that and then figuring out where's the mixture of greatest impact with lowest hanging, less minefield fruit, right?
Can I make a suggestion?
Right, and that could help determine the prioritization of each individual area. What is going to really catch the eye of the county? Where do they see opportunities? So
Yes.
it's
So-
just a suggestion as to how to prioritize the work.
I think that's a great
Thank you,
suggestion.
everybody.
I think that's a great suggestion, and it flows into one of the notes that I was going to make. On slide 5, I think it is important to have that June 2022 benchmark. I think it's good to have benchmarks, period, especially as we think about the paradigm that we're trying to keep with this 30, 60, 90 day. So perhaps with Ms. Isold and what we're saying, there's a way to split these things up so that we're working with staff and council to check in, right? Maybe 90 days, June 2022, is when we strive to have this final list of whatever it may be. Maybe in 30 days, we know staff can bring us that whole menu, and then in 60 days, we can kind of whittle it down to give those kinds of whys, as Ms. Isold was talking about, and interact with our colleagues on different governments. Maybe that's a way that we can, so we're not giving staff, hey, do all this work, you know, and then come back and then we just have too much to deal with at one time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. I think that,
I
again.
have to get off, guys. I'm sorry, but I have a.
Well, let's go ahead and make I'll repeat my motion, see if there's a second. Paragraph 1, replace 3 with all. Paragraph 2, lose the whole thing, and then put Mr. Driggs' more broad and strategic statement that he read and you guys wrote down. Paragraph 3, remove these 3, so it's not specified there. In paragraph 4, lose the entire last sentence, understanding to Julie and then Braxton's point that phase 1 is really more about the 30, 60, 90 structure of the body of work once referred that will be scoped into the list. So do I have a second on that?
So, Mr. Bakari, my suggestion was a language change to paragraph 1. It wasn't.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, understood. So, yeah, 2 separate points.
Yes.
Got it.
So that's the thing I'm suggesting, that we put in there to cooperate with other local governments.
Yeah.
To potentially produce greater levels of efficiency.
Perfect. So in that scenario, sorry, I got that wrong. Paragraph 2 is just a full delete, and that add is into paragraph 1.
Yeah.
So that's my revised motion. Second?
Second.
Any conversation? Okay, all in favor?
Yes, yes.
Driggs.
In favor.
It's
Julie's not here.
anonymous.
Yes. Yes.
Anonymous, yeah.
Great, thank you all. Is there anything else on the agenda?
No, unless,
No, sir.
you guys clear?
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
All right.
sir.
Move to close?
All right, move to close. Great meeting, guys.
Good meeting, thank you.
Ladies. Thank you.